The year was 1852. The age of steam had conquered the seas, shrinking continents and uniting empires that had once lived in isolation. Across the Mediterranean, ships belched smoke into the wind, dragging behind them the noise of the industrial world, a world that believed history had already been written, that the ruins of the past were only scenery for modern travelers. And yet one man, stepping off a vessel from Marseille, would soon discover that history still breathed beneath the stones. His name was Théophile Gautier, a poet, critic, and romantic wanderer who had dreamed all his life of painting with words what the eye could never fully capture. He came to Istanbul not for politics or profit, but for vision, for that trembling instant when beauty and decay become indistinguishable. When the ship slid into the Bosphorus under a veil of morning fog, Gautier stood at the rail, transfixed. Before him unfolded a scene that seemed to belong not to the earth, but to the imagination of a god. Minarets rose like frozen prayers, domes floated on clouds of mist, and the sunlight caught the sea until it looked like liquid glass. The harbor below swarmed with vessels from every nation. Greek schooners, British steamers, Ottoman caiques darting between them like dragonflies. It was a living mosaic of movement and color, shimmering against the pale gold of the city beyond. He later wrote that the sight was too beautiful to believe, too harmonious to be real. And indeed, it looked less like a city than a vision summoned from legend, a stage set for the dreams of emperors. Yet what awaited him beyond the harbor was not merely splendor. It was the melancholy of a civilization whose glory had curdled into silence. The streets of Istanbul were narrow and uneven, veined with the dust of centuries. The air carried the mingled scents of cardamom, seaweed, and rusting iron. Beneath the cries of vendors and the roll of carriage wheels, Gautier sensed another rhythm, the pulse of something ancient, muffled but alive. He walked for hours through bazaars where shadows trembled under colored glass lamps, through cemeteries where cypress trees leaned over marble slabs, carved with Arabic calligraphy. Everywhere he felt it, a presence, invisible yet inescapable, pressing against the present from beneath the skin of the earth. For though the Turks called their city Istanbul, much of the world still whispered its older name, Constantinople, a name that once held the weight of destiny. It had been the second Rome, the jewel of the East, the citadel where Christianity, science, and empire had fused into a single vision of eternity. For more than 1,000 years, it had defied time itself, surviving plagues, wars, and heresies. But now, standing among its broken marbles and vine-covered walls, Gautier saw only the ghost of that promise. He wrote of walking through a painting that time itself had tried to erase. In the crowded markets, he saw old Roman columns repurposed as supports for wooden stalls. In the alleys, he saw fragments of ancient capitals half buried in mud. Pigeons roosted where emperors once held court. The city seemed to have folded all its ages into one, the sacred and the profane, the living and the dead, coexisting in a strange, uneasy truce. Then one afternoon, he followed the city's edge westward, where the last houses fell away into wilderness. There, stretching across the land like a petrified serpent, he saw the walls of Constantinople, the colossal fortifications that had once been the pride of the empire. What he found was not the invincible barrier of legend, but its afterlife. Towers cracked open like bones, their interiors filled with soil and trees, walls covered in ivy so thick they seemed to be melting back into the earth. He dismounted his horse and walked along the ancient moat, now a meadow of wildflowers. He ran his hand along the stone, cool, rough, alive with moss, and felt the weight of centuries in his palm. birds nested in the gaps where soldiers had once stood watch. Figs grew from the wounds left by cannon fire. The air smelled of dust, salt, and forgotten glory. There is no road more melancholy, Gautier would write, than the one that runs between the graves of men and the ruins of their fortresses. As the sun sank, he climbed a fragment of the wall and looked back toward the city. The domes of Istanbul glowed faintly in the haze, as if lit from within by the embers of a dying fire. In that moment, he saw not the capital of the Ottoman sultans, but the last refuge of Rome, the city that had refused to die. He wondered, as so many have since, what unseen force could have broken such might. How could the empire that once ruled from Britain to Babylon have fallen, leaving behind only echoes and ruins? How could the eternal city of the East, girded by the strongest walls in the world, have faded into a melancholy dream? The answer, he suspected, was not merely war or time. It was something deeper, the slow corrosion of belief, the exhaustion of spirit that overtakes every civilization when it forgets what it was built for. In that sense, Constantinople was not unique. It was only the first to live and die, the fate that waits for all empires. The city, Gautier realized, was a mirror. In its beauty and its ruin lay the reflection of every age that had ever called itself eternal. Rome, Babylon, Thebes, Jerusalem, each had imagined itself immortal. Each had built walls, temples, and systems of power meant to outlast the sky. But time, relentless and patient, had taken them all. And yet, even as he stood among the wreckage, Gautier felt an odd kind of hope. Because if history destroys, it also preserves. Every fall leaves behind a fragment of light, a shard of meaning that endures. The ruins of Constantinople were not the proof of failure. They were the evidence of survival. That realization would haunt him for the rest of his life. And it is where our own journey begins. Welcome, listeners, to Empires Historical, where we do not merely recount the rise and fall of civilizations, but seek the pulse that still beats beneath their ashes. Here, among the forgotten stones of the Bosphorus, Gautier glimpsed a truth that echoes through time, that no empire truly dies. Its language may vanish, its banners may fade, but its memory continues. In the art, the faith, and the bones of the world it shaped. He did not yet know the full story of Byzantium, but he could feel its gravity, pulling at the imagination like a tide. And perhaps, as he walked those silent walls, he realized that what had fallen was not only a city, but an illusion. The illusion that order can last forever, that glory can be built of stone. For history, like the sea that lapped at the city's edge, takes back everything in time. But it also gives something in return. The reminder that endurance, not victory, is what defines civilization. That was the lesson Constantinople had left for the modern world. And it is the mystery we are about to unfold. Night descended slowly over the city, spreading a violet haze across the domes and towers. The sound of the muezzins drifted through the air, long, mournful, and eternal. Gautier lingered at the top of the ruined wall, unwilling to leave. Beneath him, the Bosphorus shimmered like molten steel, and the first lights of the city blinked awake one by one, reflections trembling on the water. It was as if the stars themselves had fallen and decided to dwell among men. But the beauty was not comforting. It was haunting, too perfect, too deliberate, like the smile of someone who remembers everything they've lost. Gautier wrote that he could hear the silence of vanished centuries, humming like a prayer that had forgotten its words. He sensed that the city was alive, but only in the way a ghost is alive, aware, watchful, but unable to change its fate. As he descended from the wall, he passed through broken gates where the marble still bore Latin inscriptions half erased by time. He ran his fingers over them, tracing words he could barely read. Roma Eterna, eternal Rome. He almost laughed. The phrase felt like both a boast and a curse. And yet, beneath the irony, there was admiration. For even in ruin, Constantinople refused to surrender. Its stones still stood, its streets still breathed, and its people still carried within them the stubborn heartbeat of survival. They made a desert, Gautier thought, and called it peace. But from the desert, they built eternity. In the taverns that night, he listened to sailors and merchants speak of the city's layers, each civilization built upon the bones of the last. The Byzantines had raised their palaces atop Roman foundations. The Ottomans had crowned Byzantine domes with crescents. And before them all, the Greeks had sailed here with their myths of heroes and gods. To live in Constantinople was to live in all ages at once, as if time itself had folded. He began to see the city not as a ruin, but as a palimpsest, a manuscript written and rewritten across centuries. Each new line pressed into the faint outline of the old. The ink had faded, but the meaning endured. Every empire that touched this place had left a trace, in the marble, in the language, in the faith of those who refused to leave. By the time Gautier returned to his inn, the moon was rising above the Bosphorus, turning the water to silver. He looked out from his window toward the Asian shore, the dark outline of minarets cutting through the glow. Somewhere beyond those waters had once stood the frontier of another world, the Rome that had fallen, the West that had crumbled into memory. And here, on this narrow tongue of land, the other half of that world had endured. For 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, Constantinople had stood as its heir, preserving the light of knowledge, the order of law, the rhythm of faith. It was a bridge not only between continents, but between epochs, between the ancient and the modern, the pagan and the Christian, the mortal and the eternal. To Gautier, this realization was both awe and warning. Civilizations, he thought, are like the tides. They rise not from strength, but from belief, from a shared illusion that the future belongs to them. When that illusion fades, the tide turns, the marble cracks, the songs fall silent. But even then, the sea does not forget. Standing there, listening to the distant sound of oars creaking across the Golden Horn, he felt the thin membrane that separates past from present. It was as if he could almost see them, the legions on the walls, the monks carrying lanterns through plague-stricken streets, the merchants counting coins minted in another empire's name. The city shimmered between worlds, caught forever in the act of remembering itself. And in that shimmering, Gautier understood something that history rarely admits, that no fall is absolute. The ruin of one age becomes the foundation of the next. The ashes of one civilization feed the soil of another. Constantinople had fallen 100 times, and yet it remained. It was the lesson and the warning of all human history condensed into one impossible city. That, perhaps, is why it still haunts us. For every age builds its own Constantinople, a city of dreams and ambitions, of wealth and faith, of walls meant to last forever. And every age, in its turn, will stand on the same walls and wonder, as Gautier did, what remains when eternity ends. He could not know then that within a few decades, the same forces that had devoured empires would begin to stir again. Industry, ideology, the restlessness of a world that believed it had mastered time. He could not know that in the century to come, the very idea of empire would collapse beneath the weight of its own progress. But standing there, he sensed it. The wind off the Bosphorus carried not only the scent of salt and smoke, but the breath of destiny, a whisper that every civilization, no matter how divine it believes itself, must one day kneel before time. And yet, what Gautier felt most deeply was not despair, but reverence. The city before him was not dead, it was dreaming. It had become what all great things eventually become. A memory that refuses to fade. He left Istanbul weeks later, but the image stayed with him. The broken walls glowing in the sunrise, the domes gleaming like halos above a sleeping world. He would write that Constantinople was a vision suspended between earth and heaven, between what was and what will never be again. More than a century and a half has passed since those words were written. The world has changed beyond recognition, yet the question that haunted Gautier remains. What makes a civilization endure? Is it faith, power, art, or is it something more fragile? The refusal to forget. That is the mystery at the heart of Byzantium. And it is here, among the ruins and the whispers of its lost empire, that our journey begins. So, if this vision has reached you, if you too have felt that strange ache when standing before the remnants of greatness, then join us. Subscribe to Empire's Historical and walk with us through the corridors of time. For the story of Constantinople is not merely the story of a city, it is the mirror of all human ambition, the echo of our rise, our fall, and our yearning to be remembered. For in every ruined wall, in every crumbled dome, there is a truth written in stone, that even when empires die, the dream of eternity endures. The story of Byzantium begins not in marble or empire, but in chaos. Before there were kings to carve their faces into stone, or priests to name the heavens, there was only water and fire. The Mediterranean was not yet a sea, but a wound, an immense basin carved into the earth, silent and dry, shimmering with salt under a pitiless sun. Then, one day, the world split. The narrow land that bound the Atlantic to this barren valley cracked open, and the ocean came screaming in. It was not a flood. It was creation itself. The waters fell for 1,000 days and nights, plunging down a mile-high cliff in a roar that could have drowned the sky. Entire mountain ranges dissolved beneath that furious tide. What had been desert became ocean, and what had been silence became the beating heart of civilization. The ancients never saw it, yet every myth they told carried its echo, the sea that had swallowed the world and given it back again. They would call it the Zanclean flood, though they could never truly name what it meant. For this was not only the birth of a sea, it was the beginning of destiny. From that torrent came the Mediterranean, the mother of empires, the mirror of light that would reflect the rise and fall of mankind. Along its shores, life gathered like foam at the edge of the tide. Egypt built its pyramids on its southern sands. Greece sang its gods into the western winds. Rome forged its legions beneath its northern hills. Every ship that crossed these waters carried more than trade. It carried memory, ambition, the hunger of the human soul to command the infinite. But the sea was not finished shaping its story. Around 7.5 millennia ago, when ice melted at the edges of the world and the waters rose once more, the earth trembled in the east. The narrow cliffs of the Bosphorus collapsed, and again the sea burst through. A great freshwater valley lay beyond, a green world of forests and rivers, home to villages that had known peace for generations. In days, it was gone. The waters surged, devouring fields and temples, swallowing homes and dreams. Those who survived climbed to the highlands and looked back upon the drowning of their world. They could not have known it, but they had just witnessed the making of the Black Sea. And as the story passed from voice to voice, generation to generation, it grew into myth. They said the gods had drowned the wicked. They said a man named Noah had built an ark. They said the flood was the price of arrogance, the purging of sin. In truth, it was geology made sacred, destruction given meaning. Humanity had learned even then that the sea was both mother and executioner, the silent judge of empires yet unborn. At the meeting of these two seas, the Mediterranean and the Black, lay a narrow tongue of land. There, the continents reached for each other, but never touched, their fingertips separated by a thread of blue. It was a place of convergence, of contradiction, of prophecy. Whoever held it could control the trade of nations. Whoever lost it would fade from history. The land was destiny itself, waiting for a name. It was here, on that precarious edge between worlds, that a Greek named Byzas would one day arrive. Guided by an oracle, he came seeking the land opposite the city of the blind. When he found it, he understood the riddle. Across the strait, another colony had been built on poor ground, blind to the harbor that glittered like a promise before his eyes. Byzas claimed the high peninsula where Asia and Europe nearly kissed, and there he founded his city, Byzantium, the seed of eternity. He could not have known that he was standing at the pivot of history. The harbor his people called the Golden Horn would one day cradle fleets that ruled the world. The hills he walked would one day bear domes brighter than the sun. But in that moment, the act itself was already sacred, a declaration that man could master geography, that the same sea which had drowned his ancestors could now become the road to his glory. For the rest of human history, the fate of nations would depend on that strip of water. Kings would cross it in triumph or drown in its depths. Prophets would bless it. Generals would curse it, and empires would die defending it. The Bosphorus was not a river. It was a mirror. It reflected everything mankind desired and everything it feared. Connection and separation, dominion and surrender, creation and collapse. Every empire that rose upon its banks believed it had learned the lesson of the flood. Every empire believed its walls would hold. But water remembers. It is patient. It wears down even the hardest stone, the way time wears down ambition. When the Romans came, they brought order, the cold logic of empire. They paved the earth, wrote laws into marble, turned gods into tools. They looked upon the Mediterranean and named it Mare Nostrum, our sea, as though naming could tame it. And for centuries, it obeyed. From Spain to Syria, from Egypt to Britain, their roads coiled like veins across the known world. Wealth and blood flowed back to the heart of Rome, the city that had risen from a swamp and now ruled the horizon. But every sea that nourishes also erodes. Beneath the weight of conquest, the empire hollowed. Gold filled its coffers, even as faith left its people. The world Rome had built so perfectly began to fracture along the same invisible fault lines that had once split the continents. The flood returned, not of water, but of men. Goths, Vandals, Huns, tides of humanity crashing against the gates of the civilized world. And once again, the sea remembered its nature. As Rome's western heart decayed, its eastern half endured. On the shores of the Bosphorus, the idea of empire found new life. It would be called the Eastern Roman Empire, but its soul was something older, deeper. Its people spoke Greek, dreamed in theology, and built in stone meant to defy eternity. Byzantium, the forgotten colony, would rise again, not as a city of merchants, but as a throne of the divine. The same waters that had drowned worlds would now defend one. And from their edge would rise Constantinople, the city that dared to outlast time. From the chaos of the flood, mankind had learned to build not just with stone, but with vision. The Mediterranean had become the theater of the human spirit, a mirror where ambition met eternity. At its center now stood Rome, the unchallenged master of the known world. Rome began as a spark of discipline and hunger. Its power was not born from beauty, like Greece, or faith like Egypt, but from a belief in its own permanence. It conquered not to destroy, but to impose order, the kind of order that makes the world kneel. Its legions moved like clockwork across mountains and deserts, their standards glinting with the reflected light of the sea that bound their empire together. From blood came order, from order, eternity. The Romans built roads that tied the earth into a single body, aqueducts that carried life where none had been, and cities that replicated their image in every conquered land. They named their sea ours, and for centuries it obeyed. Yet the same perfection that made Rome strong also made it brittle. For when a system believes itself immortal, it begins to rot from within. By the 2nd century, the empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. The world seemed complete, its borders unmovable, its peace eternal. Historians would call it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, though it was a peace paid for in iron. Behind its calm facade, the machinery of conquest ground endlessly forward. And then, as it always does, the world shifted. The plague came first. It swept through the empire like a shadow, killing millions. In its wake came doubt, rebellion, and the slow unraveling of certainty. The mighty city that had once ruled all others began to look inward, afraid of its own ghosts. Senators argued as soldiers deserted. The marble of its temples cracked, not from age, but from disbelief. Rome, the eternal, began to fear time. In this twilight, a new voice rose, a whisper of faith carried from the deserts of Judea to the halls of emperors. Christianity spread not by the sword, but by the promise that even death could be conquered. Where Rome offered law, the faith offered meaning. Where empire promised eternity through power, faith promised eternity through salvation. It was an idea even more dangerous than conquest. As centuries turned, the empire divided against itself. The West clung to its fading grandeur while the East looked toward the rising sun. The Emperor Diocletian, desperate to save what could not be saved, split the empire in two, one half to rule the setting sun, the other to guard the dawn. It was a decision both practical and prophetic. For in the East, on the shore of the Bosphorus, the empire would find its last refuge and its rebirth. It was Constantine, soldier, visionary, and survivor of 100 wars, who would give that rebirth form. He rose through civil strife and blood, emerging as sole ruler of a world that no longer believed in itself. On the eve of battle, he dreamed of a sign, a cross of light above the sky, and beneath it, the words, "In this sign, conquer." He won. And with victory came transformation. The empire that had crucified Christ would now bear his name. Constantine embraced Christianity not only as a faith, but as a foundation, a new myth to bind a fractured world. Yet he knew Rome itself was doomed. Its streets were haunted, its river choked with silt, its people weary. The empire needed a new heart, one that looked not to the past, but to the horizon. He searched for it across the east, through the temples of Asia Minor, the ruins of Troy, the coasts of Greece. And then, one morning, standing upon the windswept cliffs above the Bosphorus, he found it. The sea below gleamed with the light of creation, the same water that had once drowned the world. The golden horn lay open before him like the embrace of a god. He declared that here would rise a new Rome, a city of both heaven and earth, a fortress between worlds. He called it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. But in truth, it was more than his. It was the culmination of all that had come before: the flood, the sea, the trade, the blood, the dream. It was the Roman will fused with the Greek soul, the empire reborn as faith. Here, on this sacred edge between continents, civilization would make its last stand against oblivion. The city's walls would soon rise, its domes would pierce the clouds, its harbors would glow with the fires of 1,000 ships. And within those walls, humanity would preserve the light of the ancient world, long after the West had fallen into darkness. But even as the marble was laid, the shadow of the flood lingered, for every act of creation carries the echo of destruction. Constantine may have believed he was building eternity, but the sea beneath his city whispered another truth: nothing stands forever. All that rises must one day return to the waters. Still, what is civilization if not the defiance of that truth? What is faith if not the will to build upon uncertainty? Byzantium was born from that defiance, the child of flood and flame, of empire and belief. It was a reminder that mankind's greatest works are not monuments to power, but prayers against time. From the moment Constantine raised his standard over the Bosphorus, the world was changed. The center of gravity shifted eastward, away from the decaying ruins of Rome, toward a city that gleamed like a new dawn. For 1,000 years, Constantinople would stand as the last word of the ancient world and the first word of the modern one. The flood had given birth to the sea. The sea had given birth to empire. And now, from the ashes of empire, man had given birth to faith. The story of Byzantium is the story of that transformation, the moment when civilization learned that eternity could no longer be carved in stone, but must instead be carried in the human spirit. From blood came order, from order eternity, and from eternity rebirth. The birth of Constantinople was not merely the founding of a city. It was an act of faith against the inevitable. When Constantine laid the first stone, he was not building for his own time, but for eternity, a fortress to resist the slow erosion of meaning. Rome had been built for conquest. This new city would be built for survival. On the morning of its consecration in 330 AD, the air above the Bosphorus was bright with banners and incense. Priests carried relics from every corner of the empire. Fragments of the true cross, bones of martyrs, ashes of saints, as if to gather all the scattered faith of the ancient world and anchor it here upon this peninsula between continents. Constantine walked among them not as a conqueror, but as a visionary haunted by time. Behind him lay the ghost of the old empire. Before him shimmered the promise of the new. He named it Nova Roma, the New Rome, though it would soon be known by another name, Constantinopolis, the city of Constantine. The emperor believed that here, in the meeting of two seas and two worlds, heaven and earth might finally touch. And so he built it as a reflection of that dream. The new city rose in the shape of a cross. At its heart stood the Augustaeum, a vast square lined with marble colonnades where senators and soldiers, bishops and merchants passed beneath statues of emperors and saints. To the east, the great palace stretched toward the sea, a labyrinth of courtyards and golden halls overlooking the glittering waters of the Marmara. To the north, the hippodrome curved like a silver blade, its stands vast enough to hold 100,000 souls. Here, the factions of the city, the blues and the greens, would one day cheer and riot, their rivalries echoing through the centuries. Beyond these monuments, new churches rose, white and luminous, their domes like open hands lifted toward the sky. And everywhere Constantine's builders laid down roads and aqueducts, carving the geometry of empire into the flesh of the earth. The city became a living symbol of Rome reborn, but purified, transformed, baptized in light. If Rome had been the body of the empire, Constantinople was its soul. In its early centuries, the city was a marvel to behold. From the sea, its walls rose like cliffs of gold, reflecting the morning sun. Sailors entering the Golden Horn could see its 7 hills crowned with spires and domes, each gleaming with mosaics that caught the light like stars. Within its markets, languages mingled like colors: Greek, Latin, Persian, Coptic, Armenian, the sound of the known world speaking to itself. But beneath the splendor, something deeper stirred. Constantinople was more than the air of Rome. It was the keeper of memory. Within its libraries and monasteries, scribes copied the works of Plato and Aristotle, the laws of Justinian, the gospels of faith. While the Western world crumbled into silence, here the words of antiquity were preserved, like embers carried through the dark. For the Byzantines, knowledge was not luxury, it was worship. They believed that to understand creation was to praise the Creator. The empire was a cathedral made of reason and belief, an attempt to reconcile the logic of Rome with the mystery of heaven. But faith, like empire, can harden into stone. As the centuries turned, Constantinople's devotion deepened into dogma, its unity into suspicion. Councils convened to define the nature of God himself, and wars of doctrine tore the empire as cruelly as any sword. The Byzantines argued over the divinity of Christ, over icons and heresies, until theology itself became a weapon. Even as its walls grew taller, the city's certainties began to crack. Still, from those struggles came genius, for in every age of conflict, Byzantium transmuted chaos into creation. The empire's architects, seeking to express the ineffable, reached for new forms of beauty. The greatest of these would rise under Emperor Justinian, a monument that would outlive empires, a hymn carved in stone. When Justinian ascended the throne in the 6th century, the world seemed on the brink of rebirth. The plague had not yet come, and his ambition burned like a sun. He dreamed of restoring the empire of old, of reclaiming Rome itself. But he also dreamed of something greater, a city that would mirror heaven. His answer was the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. 10,000 men labored to raise it, hauling columns from the temples of Artemis and granite from the quarries of Egypt. Within 5 years, it stood complete. A dome so vast, it seemed to float upon light itself, its walls alive with gold and glass. Entering it was like stepping into the firmament, a world suspended between earth and eternity. When Justinian beheld it for the first time, he is said to have cried, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." And in a sense, he had. The Hagia Sophia was not merely a building, it was a revelation. Its design defied gravity, its symbolism defied time. To stand beneath that dome was to feel the curvature of the universe, the breath of God moving through stone. It was the triumph of Byzantium, the moment when the human imagination touched the divine. But as always, triumph and tragedy are twins. For while the city glowed with faith and marble, the empire that sustained it was cracking beneath its weight. Wars in Italy and Africa drained its coffers, plagues thinned its armies, and the same emperor who built cathedrals of light also ruled with iron. Justinian's wars against heresy and dissent turned piety into persecution. His dream of unity demanded blood. The historian Procopius, once his admirer, would later write of him in horror, of a ruler possessed by ambition, his hands stained with the ruin of nations. And yet even he could not deny the paradox of the man, a tyrant who built a sanctuary, a conqueror who sought to redeem the world. In Justinian, Byzantium revealed itself, a civilization torn between heaven and earth, reason and faith, perfection and decay. Its glory was inseparable from its suffering. The same fire that forged its greatness would one day consume it. For the city of light had been built upon the memory of the flood, and the waters were rising once again. The splendor of Justinian's age did not last. It rarely does. The same light that filled the Hagia Sophia would soon flicker under the shadow of death. In the year 541, a darkness moved through the empire. Unseen, unstoppable. Ships that brought grain from Egypt also brought the seeds of ruin, a sickness that would sweep across continents and leave 10,000 corpses a day in the streets of Constantinople. The plague of Justinian descended like divine retribution. Bodies lay unburied in every alley. The air was heavy with the stench of decay. The city that had seemed eternal suddenly trembled like a mortal thing. The emperor himself fell ill, and for weeks the empire held its breath. When he recovered, he emerged changed, gaunt, haunted, obsessed with control. He raised taxes to rebuild the army, conscripted peasants to bury the dead, and demanded that the empire continue its wars as if nothing had happened. But the world had shifted. The great campaigns in Italy and North Africa, once symbols of renewal, now became burdens too heavy to bear. The treasury drained like a wound. The legions dwindled. Even the Hagia Sophia, that miracle of faith, cracked under the weight of earthquakes and time. When its great dome collapsed in 558, it felt like an omen, as if heaven itself had grown weary of human ambition. And yet, they rebuilt it. Always, they rebuilt. That was Byzantium's answer to despair. Not surrender, but defiance. The same architects returned, altering the curve of the dome, widening the base, finding harmony where there had been failure. When it reopened, the church stood even taller, its light deeper, its silence more profound. Destruction, creation, renewal. This was the rhythm of the empire's existence. But Justinian did not live to see peace. His wars had exhausted the empire. His laws had bound it in chains of bureaucracy. His faith had divided it into camps of zealotry. When he died in 565, the world he left behind shimmered like a mirage, magnificent but fragile, vast yet hollow. The dream of restoring Rome had faded. In its place remained something stranger, something purer. The idea of Constantinople itself, a city that existed not merely in space, but in the imagination of the world. The centuries that followed were an age of endurance. The Western Empire was long gone. Barbarian kingdoms ruled where Caesar once had. But the East endured, not through conquest, but through resilience. The Byzantines learned to live with their contradictions. They were Romans who spoke Greek, Christians who read pagan philosophers, warriors who prayed to icons, mystics who built bureaucracy. They lived between worlds and made that tension their strength. Outside their walls, new powers stirred. To the north, the Slavs descended through the Balkans, carving out their own kingdoms from the empire's bones. To the east, the Persians, those ancient rivals, rose again under the banner of Zoroaster. The two empires clashed like titans across the deserts of Syria and Mesopotamia, bleeding each other white. And then, as if summoned by the exhaustion of the old world, a new force appeared from the sands. A faith young and burning, its armies swift as wind. Islam. Within a single lifetime, the Arabs conquered from the Nile to the Indus, sweeping away the relics of the old empires. When they reached the walls of Constantinople, it seemed that the flood had returned. not of water, but of belief. For years, the city was besieged. Its people watched from the battlements as the horizon burned with the camps of the caliphs. The sea below teemed with enemy ships, the land above with armies that stretched beyond sight. Inside, famine gnawed, and the churches filled with prayer. Yet the city did not fall. For Byzantium had a secret. From its docks emerged vessels armed with a weapon the world had never seen: Greek fire, a liquid flame that burned even upon the waves. No one knew its composition. It was said to be a gift from an angel, or perhaps a curse from hell. When the Arab fleet advanced, the Byzantines unleashed it. Gouts of fire erupted from bronze tubes, licking the night sky with tongues of orange light. The sea itself seemed to ignite. Men screamed as their ships turned into pyres. The siege was broken. That night, the walls of Constantinople stood bathed in firelight, the color of survival. The people wept and sang hymns until dawn. For the first time in centuries, the empire had not merely endured, it had triumphed. But victory in Byzantium was never the end. It was only another pause between storms. The city learned that to exist was to balance between miracle and disaster, between faith and ruin. Its survival was not the triumph of strength, but of meaning. The conviction that as long as Constantinople stood, the world itself had not yet ended. Even as the empire shrank, even as its provinces fell to invaders and its armies thinned, the city remained luminous. Its scholars continued to copy manuscripts by candlelight. Its priests continued to chant the same hymns sung in Justinian's time. Every dawn, the bells of Hagia Sophia rang out over the Golden Horn, and the sun rose behind the minarets and domes like the hand of God lifting the darkness one more day. To live in Constantinople was to live with the knowledge that the end would come, but not yet. The Byzantines had learned the secret of the flood, that the waters always return, but so too does the land. For every empire that drowns, another emerges from its silt. Theirs was not an empire of conquest, but of memory, of stubborn, luminous memory that refused to die. By the 7th century, the empire that Justinian had tried to stretch across the world had contracted to a single shining core, the city itself. But within that narrowing circle of light, something extraordinary was happening. Byzantium was becoming eternal, not by expanding outward, but by turning inward, transforming survival into an art, endurance into philosophy, faith into its final fortress. And so, even as plague and war, fire and heresy tore at its walls, Constantinople remained. It had been built on the edge of the flood, and it had learned to live with the tide. The city was no longer Rome. It was no longer even empire. It was something rarer. The memory of civilization itself, still breathing beneath the weight of time. By the dawn of the 7th century, the empire that had once ruled the horizon stood weary beneath the weight of its own endurance. The marble still gleamed, the hymns still rose from Hagia Sophia each morning, but the old certainty, the Roman certainty, was gone. Beyond the walls, the map of the known world was dissolving. Armies had become smoke, provinces memory. The Mediterranean, once called our sea, no longer obeyed. In this age of shadows, one figure emerged: Heraclius, son of Africa, crowned emperor of an empire on the brink. When he took the throne in 610, Constantinople was starving. Enemies surrounded it: Persians to the east, Avars and Slavs to the north, mutinous generals within. The treasury was empty, the people broken. The streets echoed with the question that had haunted the empire for centuries. Had God abandoned Rome at last? Heraclius answered not with words, but with action. He stripped the palaces of their gold, melted down icons and chalices, and turned them into coin. He dismissed mercenaries and trained farmers to fight. He prayed before the relic of the true cross, the empire's last sacred relic, and swore that he would reclaim what had been lost or die in the attempt. Then, in the spring of 622, he led his army east into the fire. For 6 years he fought the Persians, and for 6 years the empire held its breath. The war was not for territory, it was for existence. The armies met across deserts and mountains, clashing like the ghosts of two ancient gods. At Nineveh, Heraclius struck the final blow. The Persian king fell, and the relic of the cross was returned to Jerusalem. When Heraclius entered the city barefoot, carrying the sacred wood upon his shoulders, the world seemed reborn. For a moment, it felt as if Rome had risen from the grave. But empires rarely die with noise. More often, they die in the silence after victory. As the emperor returned home in triumph, a new voice was already rising from the deserts of Arabia. Quiet, fervent, unstoppable. The Prophet Muhammad had preached unity to a fractured people, and within a decade of his death, his followers poured forth from the sands like a living tide. They carried with them a revelation both spiritual and political, that there was no God but God, and no empire but faith itself. The Byzantine and Persian empires, exhausted from their war, were swept aside like ruins before the wind. Damascus fell, then Jerusalem, then Alexandria, cities that had once been the jewels of the empire. By 642, Byzantium had lost half its world. Heraclius, once hailed as a savior, returned to Constantinople broken. The empire he had saved from the Persians was now drowning beneath a new sea, not of armies, but of belief. The caliphate advanced to the very borders of Anatolia, and its banners gleamed on the far shore of the Bosphorus. From his palace window, Heraclius could see them. The fires of the encampments, the glint of swords beneath the stars. He died whispering, "Farewell, the empire." But Byzantium did not die. It bent, it adapted, it endured. The city on the strait became a fortress unlike any in history, a bastion between two worlds. The Byzantines abandoned their dreams of reconquering the West. Instead, they turned inward, crafting a civilization made not of conquest, but of survival. The armies that once marched across continents now guarded the coasts of Asia Minor. The emperors who once ruled through law now ruled through faith. They became what they had always feared becoming: different. The Romans who had spoken Latin began to speak Greek. The empire of marble became an empire of icons, of prayers painted in gold leaf and smoke. The Byzantines no longer saw themselves as Romans of the past, but as Romans of God, the last guardians of a truth older than nations. In this crucible of defeat, Byzantium was reborn. Its borders had shrunk, but its soul had deepened. Out of the ruins of imperial pride arose a new vision of order. The emperor as the earthly reflection of heaven, the empire as the body of Christ made manifest upon earth. State and faith became one. Theology replaced philosophy. Politics became liturgy. It was a dangerous alchemy, and yet, from it came endurance. For the next 3 centuries, the Byzantine world existed like a candle cupped against the storm. From its monasteries in the Anatolian hills came new hymns, new icons, new prayers. Art born not of triumph, but of longing. The empire became less a place than a state of mind, a rhythm of worship that kept the world turning even as its walls cracked. Still, the siege returned. In 674, the Arab fleets came again, sweeping across the Aegean like locusts. For 6 years, they encircled Constantinople, cutting it off from the sea, battering its walls with siege engines and flame. Inside the city, famine stalked the streets. The citizens prayed before the icons of the Virgin, begging her to protect their home. And then, as before, the empire answered with fire. Greek fire, that terrible secret, turned the night into day. The defenders poured it from the towers of the sea walls, casting rivers of flame upon the invading ships. The explosions lit the Bosphorus for miles, their reflections dancing across the water like molten gold. The Arab fleet burned. The siege broke. When the enemy retreated, the people filled Hagia Sophia once more. The patriarch led a procession through the city, and the hymn they sang would be remembered for centuries. To the Mother of God, the defender of walls. It was no longer the legions that saved the empire, but faith. By the time the fires died, Byzantium had become something entirely new, a civilization tempered by catastrophe. Its greatness no longer lay in conquest, but in resilience. It was not an empire of expansion, but an empire of meaning. And within that meaning, something rare was taking shape. The idea that a civilization could endure not by dominating the world, but by preserving the light within itself. The centuries that followed were a long twilight, neither death nor rebirth, but a quiet battle for the soul. The empire that had survived the sword now faced a more intimate enemy: doubt. When the tide of invasion receded, it left behind not peace, but questions. What had kept Byzantium alive? Was it its walls, its emperors, its fire, or something deeper? The answer divided the empire itself. In the years after the sieges, the empire turned inward, its spirit hardened by loss. Out of this tension emerged the most bitter of its wars, not of armies, but of faith. It began with an emperor who believed the empire's weakness was divine punishment. The Arabs had swept across the world because God, he claimed, had been angered by idolatry. The holy images that filled every church and home, the icons of Christ and the Virgin, were not symbols, he said, but sins. Thus began the iconoclast controversy, the war over images. Statues were torn down, mosaics whitewashed, frescoes scraped from the walls of cathedrals that had glowed for centuries. Monks were imprisoned for refusing to destroy their icons. Some were tortured, some were executed. The empire that had built itself upon the harmony of heaven and earth now turned upon its own reflection. And yet, even in this darkness, beauty found a way to speak. In secret, artisans hid their icons beneath floors, behind walls, in caves and catacombs. They painted by candlelight, not for glory, but for remembrance, a rebellion in pigment and prayer. Their brushstrokes became whispers of defiance. Not all faith can be erased. The conflict lasted more than a century. Emperors rose and fell, councils condemned and restored the use of icons, but through it all, the deeper truth of Byzantium emerged. This was not a world of blind dogma. It was a world that wrestled openly with its own contradictions. The Byzantines did not seek certainty. They sought meaning. They asked not merely who God was, but how a human being could reflect divinity without consuming it. Their art became theology, and their theology became art. When at last the icons returned to their altars, the empire celebrated not with triumph, but with tears. The restoration was called the triumph of orthodoxy. Yet it was not victory that defined it. It was reconciliation. The empire had rediscovered its balance between image and idea, between heaven and earth, between the visible and the unseen. It was this balance, fragile but enduring, that allowed Byzantium to rise once more. By the 9th century, the empire began to breathe again. The frontiers stabilized. The Arab advance slowed. The Slavs who had once raided the Balkans were baptized into the faith, becoming allies instead of enemies. Trade returned to the harbors, scholars to the libraries, laughter to the markets. The city of Constantinople, that eternal heart, pulsed with new life. From its ashes emerged a new dynasty, the Macedonian emperors, who would oversee a renaissance as radiant as any in history. Under their rule, Byzantine art, law, and scholarship flourished. The works of Homer and Plato were recopied with care. The mosaics of Hagia Sophia were restored in gold and sapphire. The empire, once a remnant of Rome, now stood as a civilization entirely its own, neither Greek nor Roman, neither East nor West, but something in between, a bridge of light suspended over the abyss. Its emperors governed with a mixture of ceremony and calculation. The court of Constantinople became the most intricate machine of diplomacy the world had ever known. Envoys from every kingdom came to kneel before the emperor, the basileus of the Romans, whose robes shimmered like molten sunlight. To them, Byzantium was more than power. It was theater, ritual, eternity made visible. The city itself was a sermon in stone, every gate and dome a reminder that the divine could still dwell among men. Yet even in this age of revival, the memory of the flood lingered. The Byzantines never forgot how easily the world could drown. Their literature was filled with laments, their hymns with longing. They sang of a city that was both fortress and exile, both promise and punishment. They had inherited from their ancestors not the arrogance of Rome, but the humility of survival. Their architects rebuilt the walls of Theodosius, those triple lines of stone and moat that still guarded the city after 500 years. They repaired every tower, refilled every ditch, strengthened the gates until they seemed unbreakable. Each stone was a prayer against oblivion, each brick a vow that the city would never fall. And yet, the Byzantines knew that strength alone wouldn't save them. Their empire had become an island of order in a sea of chaos, but even islands erode. The real power of Byzantium was not in its armies or walls. It was in its idea. It was the conviction that civilization itself was sacred, that beauty and knowledge and faith were not luxuries, but acts of survival. In that conviction lay the empire's greatest gift to the world: continuity. When others forgot, Byzantium remembered. When others burned their libraries, Byzantium copied. When others surrendered to despair, Byzantium sang. As the 10th century dawned, the empire stretched once more across the eastern Mediterranean. Its banners flew over Crete and Cyprus, over Syria and the Balkans. But its victories were no longer measured in miles or battles. Its triumph was the fact of its endurance, that after centuries of siege, plague, and heresy, the city still stood, its domes shining like constellations upon the sea. To stand upon its walls at dusk was to see eternity made visible. The sun sank behind the western hills, casting long shadows over the Golden Horn, while the first lights of the city flickered below like stars reborn. Somewhere, the bells of Hagia Sophia began to ring, each chime a heartbeat that had endured through the centuries. This was Byzantium at its height, not because it ruled the world, but because it had learned to rule itself. It had mastered the art of balance, the art of survival, the art of believing without seeing. It had become what its founders dreamed, a city of both heaven and earth, reflection and reality, memory and hope. But history, like the sea, does not rest. The tide that had receded for centuries was already gathering again beyond the horizon. The world was changing, and once more, Constantinople would be tested. By the middle of the 10th century, the city on the strait had become more than a capital. It was the axis of a world. Constantinople stood radiant at the center of 3 continents, a mirror to the heavens, a living mosaic of gold and shadow. Ships from every sea crowded its harbors. Pilgrims, scholars, and merchants filled its markets. From the hilltops, the domes of Hagia Sophia and the palace of the Basileus shimmered like suns upon the marble skin of the earth. To the west, the kingdoms of Europe were young and uncertain, their cathedrals still made of wood. To the east, the caliphate fractured under its own vastness, and in between them stood Byzantium, calm and ageless, the single thread that still connected the ancient world to the new. It was an empire of ritual and reason, of beauty made tangible, a place where faith was not a refuge from the world, but its completion. The Macedonian dynasty had given the empire new life. Under Basil I and his heirs, the Byzantines reclaimed lost lands, restored their fleets, and reopened the arteries of trade that had long been silent. The empire's scholars preserved the forgotten words of antiquity, Euclid, Galen, Plato, not as relics, but as living companions in the search for truth. Their monasteries became citadels of memory, their scriptoria the arteries through which civilization still bled ink instead of blood. It was an age of brilliance, yet not of arrogance. The Byzantines had learned that greatness built on conquest alone would one day collapse. They turned instead to subtler forms of dominion, diplomacy, learning, ceremony. The emperor's court became the theater of the world, an endless choreography of processions and hymns, every gesture pregnant with meaning. When foreign envoys entered the great palace, they passed through halls of onyx and porphyry, where golden, mechanical birds sang and bronze lions roared by hidden gears. It was spectacle as philosophy, an assertion that order itself could be art. And at the heart of this theater stood the emperor, the Basileus ton Romaion, the emperor of the Romans, the living axis between God and man. Clad in robes of Tyrian purple, crowned with pearls and fire, he ruled not by the sword, but by symbolism. His throne was both an altar and a warning, that power was not merely to be held, but to be sanctified. This balance, of faith and state, of intellect and ritual, was Byzantium's genius. It allowed the empire to thrive in an age of turbulence, to navigate between barbarism and enlightenment. Constantinople was not only defended by its walls, but by its idea of order, a concept so compelling that even its enemies, when they came to plunder, could not help but imitate it. From the empire's borders came both threat and admiration. In the north, the Rus, fierce warriors from the forests of Kiev, sailed down the rivers of the Black Sea in dragon-prowed ships. At first, they came to raid, burning villages and blockading the Bosphorus. But the city could not be taken. The walls of Theodosius, 3 rings of stone and iron, had defied every army that touched them. When the Rus saw their flames reflected in those unbroken ramparts, they turned from conquest to curiosity. In 987, their prince, Vladimir of Kiev, sent envoys to study the faiths of the world. They visited mosques, synagogues, and the churches of the West, but it was in Constantinople that they found the divine. They entered Hagia Sophia during the liturgy, and when they returned they said, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, for there is no such beauty anywhere." From that encounter, an empire was born in spirit. The baptism of Rus in the waters of the Dnieper would carry Byzantine Christianity across the vastness of Eastern Europe, long after Byzantium itself had fallen. Faith had achieved what armies could not. Within the walls of the city, art reached its zenith. Mosaics shimmered across ceilings like constellations. Icons glowed in candlelight, their faces not portraits but presences. To gaze upon them was not to see an image, but to enter a dialogue between the mortal and the divine. Every brushstroke, every fragment of gold was a prayer, an attempt to make visible the invisible. The scholars of Constantinople refined not only theology, but administration, law, and diplomacy. They codified the ancient Roman statutes into the basilica, a body of law that would echo in Europe for centuries. They mapped the heavens, studied medicine, debated Aristotle, and illuminated manuscripts whose beauty rivaled scripture itself. They called their civilization Romania, yet it had become something else. A mind more than a state, a continuity of consciousness that stretched from Athens to Jerusalem, from Rome to the Bosphorus. And yet, beneath this serenity, the empire was changing. Power had shifted from the emperor to the bureaucracy, from the soldier to the scribe. Wealth concentrated in the hands of magnates whose estates sprawled across Anatolia, while peasants, once the empire's backbone, began to disappear into debt. The army grew smaller, its loyalty more fragile. The city still glittered like a crown, but the hand that wore it was growing weak. Beyond its borders, new forces gathered. In the west, the Latin Church grew restless beneath Byzantine pride. The patriarchs of Constantinople and the popes of Rome spoke different tongues, prayed with different gestures, and saw in each other not brothers, but rivals. To the south, the caliphs regrouped, now less united, but no less dangerous. And to the east, a new people rode out of the steppes. Turks, hardened by wind and battle, carrying with them the hunger of a world yet unmade. The Byzantines saw the horizon darken, but they did not despair. They had lived too long beside the abyss to fear it. Their answer was the same as it had always been: beauty. As the first storms gathered beyond the mountains, the empire poured its soul into art and ceremony, as if to outlast its own mortality through wonder. Even at the edge of decline, Constantinople was the envy of the earth. Travelers who entered its gates spoke of a city unlike any other. Its streets paved with marble, its markets overflowing with silk and spice, its air thick with incense and song. From the Galata hills, one could see the golden domes rise like a mirage against the sea, their reflections trembling in the waters of the Horn. To live there was to walk inside a dream of order, to believe, however briefly, that man had truly touched the divine. But dreams, too, have their limits. The empire that had once survived plague and fire would now face a subtler peril, one born not of invasion, but of pride. The glory of Byzantium was a light that blinded as it shone. It had survived the sword, the plague, and the tide of empires, but now it faced the oldest enemy of all, itself. For even marble, when polished too long, begins to crack from within. The church that had once united a continent began to divide. East and west, once joined by faith, turned their faces from one another. Rome accused Constantinople of arrogance, of pride, of heresy. Constantinople accused Rome of ambition, of corruption, of forgetting the language of heaven. The dispute was more than words. It was the splitting of a soul. In 1054, papal legates entered Hagia Sophia and laid upon its altar a bull of excommunication. The patriarch answered in kind. The choir still sang, the candles still burned, but a silence had entered the world that would never be lifted. The great schism had come, and though no armies marched, its wound would bleed for centuries. The Byzantines continued to call themselves Romans, but the West no longer listened. To Europe, they were now Greeks, alien, exotic, untrustworthy. The empire that had once been the teacher of nations was becoming a relic, admired, but unloved. Its wealth inspired envy, its sophistication, contempt. And while the world debated its faith, the frontiers trembled again. From the east came the Seljuk Turks, horsemen hardened by the steppe, carrying the crescent into lands that had once echoed with the chants of Byzantium. At Manzikert in 1071, the imperial army met them on the plains of Armenia and was shattered. The emperor himself, Romanos Diogenes, was captured. The fields of Anatolia, the empire's heart, were lost. Within a generation, the granary of Byzantium had become the homeland of another faith. For the first time in centuries, Constantinople felt the weight of hunger. The loss of Anatolia was not only territorial, it was spiritual. The monasteries, the peasantry, the quiet rhythm of Byzantine life had all grown from that soil. Without it, the empire was hollowed from within. The bureaucracy turned on itself. Generals became warlords. The throne became a prize for intrigue rather than duty. Yet, even as its world fractured, the city still gleamed. Like a jewel at dusk, its beauty only deepened as its power waned. Then, from the west, came salvation, or so it seemed. When Pope Urban II called the First Crusade in 1095, he spoke of freeing the Holy Land from the infidel. Yet beneath his words lay another hunger, for wealth, for land, for redemption through blood. The knights of Europe, armored and burning with zeal, crossed into Byzantine territory like a tide of iron. Emperor Alexios the Furg Komnenos received them not as heroes, but as a storm to be endured. He fed them, guided them, and sent them eastward, away from his capital, away from the fragile heart of the empire. For a time, it worked. The Crusaders carved their kingdoms in Syria and Palestine, and Constantinople breathed again. Trade flourished, alliances formed. The empire even regained fragments of its lost provinces, but the peace was poisoned from the beginning. To the Crusaders, the Byzantines were not brothers, but heretics dressed in gold. To the Byzantines, the Crusaders were not saviors, but barbarians pretending at holiness. Distrust became prophecy. In 1204, prophecy became ruin. The Fourth Crusade, called in the name of Christ, turned its ships not toward Jerusalem, but toward Constantinople. The reasons were tangled: debts, politics, manipulation, but the result was clear. The greatest Christian city on earth became the target of Christian armies. For 3 days, the city burned. The Crusaders breached the sea walls with Venetian ships, stormed through the gates, and loosed upon the streets a fury the world had not seen since the sack of Rome. The mosaics of Hagia Sophia were shattered beneath their swords. The altars were stripped of gold. Relics were scattered, sold, or burned. Nuns were dragged from their cloisters. Libraries, filled with the words of 1,000 years, were fed to fire. The horses of the Crusaders were stabled in the cathedral itself, their hooves clattering where choirs had once sung. It was not conquest, it was desecration. When the flames died, Constantinople was no longer the queen of cities, but a carcass divided among scavengers. The Crusaders crowned a Latin emperor and looted what remained. The Byzantine nobility fled across the sea to Nicaea and Epirus, carrying with them the last fragments of legitimacy, the last embers of the old light. For half a century, the empire was gone, erased from its own capital. And yet, even then, Byzantium refused to die. From exile, its people rebuilt their world in miniature. In the monasteries of Nicaea, they rewrote the scriptures. In hidden workshops, they repaired shattered icons. In distant markets, they whispered the memory of a city that would one day rise again. It was not hope they preserved, it was identity. The conviction that their civilization was more than walls or crowns. It was an inheritance of the soul. In 1261, under the Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, they returned. The Byzantines recaptured their city, entering through a secret gate before dawn. When the banners of the double-headed eagle rose once more above the walls, the people wept as if eternity had been restored. But the Constantinople they reclaimed was not the one they remembered. Its palaces stood roofless, its aqueducts dry, its harbors half-deserted. The city that had once commanded the world was now a ruin haunted by glory. And yet the bells rang again. Hagia Sophia, blackened by smoke, was cleansed and reconsecrated. The streets were cleared, the markets reopened. The empire lived, smaller, poorer, but unbroken. Still, the light that returned was a twilight. The world around had changed. In the west, new kingdoms rose with steel and gunpowder. In the east, a new power was rising on the steppes, the Ottoman Turks, heirs of conquest and patience. The empire had been reborn, but time itself had turned against it. Byzantium had outlived Rome, Persia, and 1,000 kings, yet it could not outlive the tide of history. Its final centuries would not be of conquest or glory, but of grace. The long evening of a civilization that had seen everything, lost everything, and still sang beneath the fading light. By the 14th century, Byzantium had become a ghost that still dreamed. Its emperors ruled from palaces half in ruin. Its nobles argued in chambers where the wind blew through broken glass. Beyond the city walls, the empire no longer existed. Only fragments, islands of memory scattered across the Aegean. The double-headed eagle still fluttered over the sea, but one head looked west in desperation, the other east in fear. The wings were tired, and yet, even in decline, Constantinople remained luminous. Travelers from Venice and Genoa, from Arabia and the steppes, all spoke of its strange endurance, a city still glittering like a mirror of heaven, while the world around it sank into war. By day, its streets were filled with merchants and priests, beggars and philosophers. By night, the domes of Hagia Sophia caught the moonlight and shone like a lantern above the sleeping sea. It was as if the city itself refused to believe that it could die. The emperors of the Palaeologan dynasty ruled over ruins with the gravity of kings. Michael VIII had restored the empire's name, but not its strength. His successors, Andronicus and John, inherited a throne that was more symbol than state. To the west, the Latin kingdoms eyed the city with greed. To the north, the Slavs and Hungarians demanded tribute. To the east, the rising Ottomans advanced with the patience of time. Byzantium, once the center of the world, was now a frontier. And yet, from its decay, arose a strange flowering. The artists and scholars of the city, aware that their world was ending, began to preserve it with feverish devotion. The final centuries of Byzantium became an age of exquisite melancholy, of mosaics more delicate, hymns more sorrowful, prayers more desperate. Every church, every manuscript seemed to be written as a farewell. They painted Christ not in triumph, but in compassion, eyes heavy with the knowledge of inevitable loss. The Virgin no longer lifted her arms in majesty, but opened them in mourning. The art of the empire became its requiem, the beauty of endurance, the holiness of decline. Meanwhile, beyond the marble walls, history gathered like a storm. The Ottomans had crossed from Asia into Europe. They were not raiders, but architects of conquest. Patient, methodical, relentless. They built cities where they conquered, roads where they marched, faith where they ruled. By 1360, they had taken Adrianople, less than 200 miles from the capital. The Emperor John V traveled to the west, not as a ruler, but as a beggar, pleading for aid from the kings of Christendom. He knelt before the Pope, offering reunion of the churches, offering even his crown, if only someone would save his city. No one came. Europe, distracted by its own wars and schisms, looked away. To the Latin kingdoms, Byzantium was no longer a sister, but an old, proud relic, a reminder of what they had surpassed. To them, the Eastern Church was a heresy better forgotten. And so, the empire stood alone, surrounded by a world that had already consigned it to history. The city adapted to its isolation with the grace of a dying saint. Its people learned to live on faith and memory. Farmers brought grain from the few remaining lands of Thrace. Monks tended vineyards in the ruins of monasteries. Merchants traded relics, silk, and hope. Life went on as it always had, beneath the shadow of extinction. Inside Hagia Sophia, the light still fell as it had for 1,000 years, filtering through the same high windows that Justinian had built. But the congregation was smaller now, their hymns quieter, their prayers heavier. When the choirs sang, their voices rose like a memory of empire, as if the sound itself could hold back the centuries. There were moments when it seemed the old miracle might repeat itself. The Ottomans fought their own civil wars. The empire survived by diplomacy, by chance, by the sheer inertia of faith. The Byzantines became masters of endurance, negotiating not from strength, but from the illusion of necessity. They married their daughters to sultans, sent their sons as hostages, bartered time itself. They were not fools. They knew the clock was running out, but they also knew that every moment stolen from oblivion was sacred. And so, even in its last century, Byzantium gave birth to new ideas. Scholars translated Plato and Aristotle into Latin, carrying the seeds of the Renaissance westward. Refugees from Constantinople would one day ignite the revival of learning in Florence and Venice, though they themselves would not live to see it. The empire that was dying was already teaching the world how to live again. In this way, Byzantium became eternal, not through survival, but through surrender, by allowing its spirit to flow into the veins of others. It was as if the city understood that the only immortality possible to man is memory, but memory alone could not hold the walls. By the 1440s, the empire had become a single city, surrounded by the dominion of the Ottoman sultans. The fields beyond its gates belonged to the enemy. The waters of the Bosphorus were filled with Turkish ships. Yet within those walls, life still moved with the rhythm of eternity. Priests held processions by torchlight. Children played among the ruins of forums where emperors once stood. Bells rang each morning for a world that had already ended. The last emperor, Constantine V Palaiologos, ruled over a dream. His title was ancient, but his kingdom was no larger than a memory. He knew what was coming. Every man in the city did. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, young, brilliant, and relentless, was gathering an army unlike any the world had seen. Cannons larger than houses were being cast across the straits. Ships built in secret glided toward the capital. The sea walls that had defied Attila and the caliphs would now face thunder made of iron. Yet still, the city refused to flee. Constantine gathered his council and spoke plainly. We are the last of the Romans. We fight not for victory, but for remembrance. The word spread through the streets like fire. The citizens, Greeks, Armenians, Italians, even Turks who had found refuge within the walls, prepared together for the final siege. They repaired battlements, blessed weapons, sang hymns of defiance. The city was dying, but it would die as it had lived, with dignity, with faith, with beauty. And when the drums began to thunder from across the plain, when the horizon turned red with the banners of Islam, the people of Constantinople lit their candles and prayed. They knew the dawn that came next would be the last. In the spring of 1453, the hills of Thrace trembled under the weight of an army drawn from 3 continents. At its head rode Mehmed II, only 21 years old, his ambition burning brighter than the fire of his cannons. Behind him came a force of more than 100,000 men, Turks, Persians, Arabs, and mercenaries from every shore of the known world. At their center, dragged by oxen and iron chains, rolled a weapon that would change the age, the Great Bombard, a cannon so vast it could hurl stones heavier than a man across the Golden Horn. From the walls, the people of Constantinople watched the plain darken with tents and banners. They heard the clang of hammers as the Ottomans built their siege towers, saw the glitter of armor stretching to the horizon. Inside the city were perhaps 7,000 defenders, Greeks, Venetians, Genoese, monks, and boys too young for war. They prayed, and then they prepared. Every dawn, the same ritual. The sound of bells from Hagia Sophia, the smell of oil and dust, the shimmer of faith upon exhausted faces. They patched the walls with stones scavenged from fallen houses. They carried water to the wounded, sang hymns beneath the crash of artillery. The siege was not only of stone, but of spirit, a test of how long hope could survive under the shadow of inevitability. For 53 days, the city endured. Cannonballs shattered the towers, but men filled the gaps with their own bodies. Fire rained from the sky, yet the defenders fought on, their armor glowing red beneath the flames. The cry of Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, rose like thunder from the battlements, answered by the Ottoman chant of Allahu Akbar. 2 worlds, 2 faiths, facing one another across the same broken wall. At night, the emperor walked the ramparts alone. The moonlight shone on his armor, old, mended, the bronze dulled by years. He spoke little. Those who saw him said that his face had the calm of one who had already made peace with destiny. Constantine knew that no help was coming. The West had sent promises, not armies. The last empire of Rome would stand or fall by its own faith. On May 28th, the final night, the city held a single great liturgy in Hagia Sophia. Every class, every tongue, every creed of Byzantium gathered beneath the dome for the last time. Candles glowed like stars. The air was thick with incense and weeping. As the priests raised the chalice, the people knelt on marble worn by 1,000 years of footsteps. They prayed not for victory, but for forgiveness, that their world might be remembered kindly by the God who had watched it rise. At dawn, the end came. The Ottoman drums thundered like the heartbeat of the earth. The great cannon roared, splitting the morning air. The walls cracked and buckled. Through the smoke and dust came the flood of soldiers, wave after wave, screaming the name of their God. The defenders met them with sword and spear, fighting not for land, but for meaning. Somewhere near the gate of St. Romanus, the last emperor vanished into the chaos. The chroniclers would later say that he tore the imperial insignia from his armor and charged into the breach. Others claimed they found his body buried beneath his men, his face serene in death. No one knows. What is certain is that when the banners of the crescent rose above the city, the line of the Roman emperors, begun 1,000 years before with Augustus, ended in silence. When the fighting ceased, Mehmed rode through the shattered gates. The air was thick with dust and the smell of smoke. Corpses lay in the streets, churches stood empty and looted. Yet when he entered Hagia Sophia, the young conqueror dismounted. He looked up into the vast dome, where the mosaics still glittered through the haze, and he whispered a prayer. There is no God but God. Then he ordered the building to be cleansed and consecrated anew, not destroyed, but transformed. So ended Constantinople, and so began Istanbul. The people of the city were led away in chains. The bells of Hagia Sophia were melted down for cannon. The libraries, the relics, the mosaics, all scattered to the winds. But the idea that had been Byzantium did not vanish. Ideas do not die. They migrate. In the years that followed, the survivors of the empire carried with them manuscripts and memories. They fled to Crete, to Venice, to Florence. There, in the courts of the Medici, Greek scholars unfolded the books of Plato, Aristotle, and Homer. The same texts Byzantium had preserved for 1,000 years. The light that went out over the Bosphorus ignited again in the West as the Renaissance. From the ruins of Constantinople rose the rebirth of Europe. And though the city fell, its legacy endured in ways no conqueror could have foreseen. Its law shaped the codes of nations. Its theology defined the Orthodox world from Russia to the Balkans. Its art, its architecture, its mysticism all became part of humanity's collective memory. Even its defeat taught the world something profound: that beauty, when faced with destruction, can achieve immortality through loss. For what was Byzantium in the end, if not a vision of order carved from chaos, of light preserved through darkness? It was the bridge between worlds, the dream that outlived the empire that dreamt it. Its story was not a tragedy, but a transfiguration, the turning of flesh into idea, of empire into eternity. Centuries later, travelers standing on the shores of the Golden Horn would still see the same sun rising over the same waters. The domes would gleam again, though their prayers were different. Yet beneath the call to prayer, one might still hear the faint echo of another song, the ghost of a choir that once sang in Greek, asking mercy for a world that would not return. And in that echo lies the true miracle of Byzantium, that even in death it continued to speak. Its marble cracked, its empire gone, yet its voice, the voice of the philosopher, the monk, the emperor, remained. It whispered through the ages, reminding all who would listen that no civilization is ever lost, only transformed. The last city of Rome had fallen, but the dream it carried of light over darkness, of faith over fear, of order born from ruin, was only beginning to ascend. The Empire of Byzantium ended on a Tuesday morning in the year 1453. But in truth, it never ended at all. When a civilization dies, it does not vanish. It lingers, in language, in ritual, in the quiet architecture of thought. Byzantium's walls may have fallen, but its pattern remained, woven into the fabric of the world like gold threads in old silk. To speak of Byzantium, even centuries after its fall, is to touch the living pulse of memory itself. The empire had begun as Rome's shadow, and it ended as Europe's mirror. Between those two reflections, it defined what it meant to endure. For 1,000 years, it stood at the hinge of continents, keeping the world in fragile balance. And even in its death, it left behind not silence, but resonance, a vibration of spirit that reached beyond the limits of geography or creed. In the ruins of its palaces, something remarkable happened. The stones did not only decay, they taught. Each broken capital, each fragment of mosaic became a teacher of resilience. Artists from Venice, Florence, and Moscow studied the remnants and found in them a language of light and order. The Renaissance, which Europe would later claim as its own rebirth, was, in truth, Byzantium's final breath, the exhalation of its long, contemplative life. The manuscripts rescued from its libraries became the foundations of Western philosophy, art, and science. Its theology inspired the mystics of the East. Its icons whispered across centuries of prayer. But Byzantium's true legacy was not only in what it created, it was in what it symbolized, a vision of the world where beauty and reason, faith and empire could coexist without devouring one another. It was the belief that civilization could be an act of devotion, that order, if shaped by the hand of conscience, could be holy. To understand Byzantium is to understand the paradox of humanity itself, our hunger for permanence in a world of impermanence, our longing to make the temporal eternal. The Byzantines built their city not merely from stone, but from metaphysics, an architecture of meaning. Every dome mirrored the heavens, every hymn was a negotiation between despair and hope. To them, faith was not escape, but structure, a scaffolding for the fragile edifice of being. And so, when the city fell, it was not simply a military defeat. It was the collapse of a worldview, of a grand equation between the mortal and the divine. The Ottomans took the land, but the idea of Byzantium slipped through their fingers like light through smoke. Centuries passed, empires rose and claimed succession. The Russian czars declared themselves czars, heirs of the Roman and Byzantine line. The cross was raised over Moscow, and the city was called the Third Rome. They built cathedrals with onion domes inspired by Hagia Sophia, and wrote their laws in the echo of the Byzantine code. Even those who had never seen the Bosphorus carried its image in their minds, the vision of a city poised between earth and eternity. And yet, in another sense, Byzantium lives everywhere. Its ghost lingers in the way cathedrals cast their shadows over European towns, in the paintings that still try to capture divine light, in the idea that knowledge itself can be sacred. Its essence lies not in empire, but in continuity, the belief that culture can survive conquest, that truth can survive ruin. But the story of Byzantium is not only about legacy. It is also a warning. The empire endured for a millennium, not by force alone, but by adaptability. And when it ceased to adapt, it began to die. Its scholars debated angels while its enemies learned the language of gunpowder. Its emperors clung to ritual while the world beneath them shifted like sand. Pride, that most human of virtues and vices, became its final chain. In the quiet halls of Hagia Sophia, where prayers once rose like mist, we can still hear the echo of that mistake, the danger of believing that time can be mastered. For time is the one empire that never falls. Even so, there is a kind of redemption in Byzantium's ending, a grace born of acceptance. When the last emperor rode into battle knowing he would never return, he became not a ruler, but a symbol. His courage was not that of conquest, but of understanding that to die well is also to endure. In his fall, the empire achieved what it had always sought, the transmutation of the mortal into the eternal. The city itself became a parable. Its rise and ruin are not only history, but metaphor, a meditation on the cycle of all human things. Every empire begins in faith, grows in order, declines in pride, and ends in remembrance. The pattern repeats across continents and ages, like the echo of a forgotten prayer. Perhaps this is why Byzantium still haunts us, because in it we recognize ourselves, our ambition, our beauty, our blindness. Its history is not a distant relic, but a mirror, showing how the same hands that build cathedrals can also dig graves, how the same hunger for greatness that makes art can also make war. And yet, within that contradiction lies our humanity. If you walk today along the shores of the Bosphorus, where fishermen cast their nets into the same waters that once reflected imperial fleets, you can still sense it, the hum beneath the noise of modern Istanbul. The city has changed names and masters, but its soul remains Byzantine, layered, luminous, unresolved, It is a place where muezzin calls mingle with the tolling of church bells, where the East and West still meet, not in harmony, but in tension. And in that tension lies beauty, the same fragile beauty Byzantium always knew, that perfection is not in stillness, but in struggle. So perhaps the real question is not why Byzantium fell, but how it lasted. How did one city, one idea, endure the collapse of antiquity, the storms of plague, the fires of war, and still remain itself? The answer lies not in power, but in faith, not the narrow faith of creed, but the broad faith of persistence. Byzantium believed in its own meaning, even when the world no longer did. That, above all, was its secret. The stubborn conviction that civilization is worth defending, even when defense seems futile. And because of that, we remember it. Empires, like men, are born twice, once into the world and once into memory. Byzantium's second birth began the moment it died. Its body was buried beneath the minarets of a new age, but its mind diffused across the continents like perfume lingering after the candle is extinguished. Every civilization that came after would inherit a fragment of its dream. The faith that beauty could hold back the dark, that thought could outlast time. In this way, Byzantium became not a nation, but a condition of the soul. Its endurance revealed a truth older than any empire, that what humanity seeks most is not dominion, but meaning. Power fades, walls crumble, kings turn to dust, yet the idea that life itself can be sanctified, that art and reason can be a form of prayer, endures. To walk among the relics of Byzantium today is to stand inside that paradox. The mosaics of Ravenna, the domes of Moscow, the libraries of Florence, all are fragments of a vanished whole. Each carries within it the same impulse that once shaped the stones of Constantinople, the desire to bridge the mortal and the divine. The gold leaf that once shimmered in Hagia Sophia now glows in paintings across Europe. The hymns of its choirs echo in cathedrals far from the Bosphorus. The empire fell, but its imagination conquered the world, and perhaps this was always its destiny. Byzantium lived between worlds, between Europe and Asia, reason and faith, heaven and earth. It was never meant to last as a kingdom. It was meant to endure as an idea. Its fall was not failure, but completion, the transformation of history into myth, of time into eternity. We call its story tragic, yet it contains a strange serenity. The Byzantines understood something that the modern world has nearly forgotten. That loss is not the opposite of creation, but part of it. Their art, their theology, their philosophy, all were born from the contemplation of decay. They believed that what perishes becomes sacred precisely because it perishes. In the gleam of their mosaics, in the melancholy of their hymns, they turned mortality into revelation. When Justinian raised the dome of Hagia Sophia, he said he wished to make visible the order of heaven. 15 centuries later, the dome still stands, scarred, restored, reimagined, and still it draws the eye upward. Its geometry whispers that human hands, though frail, can imitate eternity for a moment. And perhaps that moment is enough. The empire's story ends where all human stories end, not in the fall of cities, but in the silence that follows. Yet from that silence, other voices rise. The modern historian, the pilgrim, the dreamer, all hear something different in Byzantium's echo. Some hear warning that all empires fall and that power is only borrowed from the patience of time. Others hear comfort, that beauty and wisdom, once born, cannot be erased. If you stand today in the gallery of Hagia Sophia and look upward, the light still behaves as it did 1,000 years ago. It filters through the same narrow windows, descends in slow rays, and settles upon the marble floor like a benediction. It touches Muslim and Christian alike. It does not choose. The building has been a church, a mosque, a museum, and now, again, a mosque. And through every transformation, the light has remained the same. Perhaps that is Byzantium's final lesson, that truth is not ownership, but endurance. Civilizations rise when they believe in something greater than themselves, and they fall when they forget what that was. Byzantium remembered longer than most. It remembered that knowledge is worship, that architecture is prayer, that art can be theology. It remembered that an empire, at its best, is not a machine of conquest, but a reflection of the human attempt to bring order to chaos. The world today is full of new empires, of technology, of economy, of ideology, each believing itself eternal. Yet beneath their brilliance lies the same fragility that haunted Constantinople. They too will one day fade, leaving behind only the question Byzantium asked in every generation: what will survive of us? The answer may lie not in our monuments, but in our consciousness. The true empire of man is not land or power, but memory. The stories we tell to resist oblivion. In that sense, Byzantium still rules. Every time we speak of beauty as truth, of order as grace, of endurance as victory, we speak its language. Its empire ended in fire, but its spirit continues in the quiet spaces of the mind, in every act of creation born from ruin, in every hand that builds knowing it will not endure. Byzantium is not gone. It is the gleam in every cathedral window, the silence between notes of sacred music, the idea that the finite can touch the infinite. So when we look back upon that shining city by the Bosphorus, its towers gone, its empire dust, we do not see defeat. We see reflection. We see what humanity can be when it remembers that civilization is not conquest, but compassion, not domination, but devotion. Byzantium fell because it was human, but it is remembered because it aspired to be divine, and that is why its story will never end. For as long as men build cities, as long as they raise their eyes toward heaven and whisper that the world can be made sacred, Byzantium lives, not as a place, nor as a people, but as the eternal bridge between what we are and what we dream to be.